Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Tierney, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a panel that's addressing one of the most important issues in Australian education, the education of Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, in need, I think, and the panelists would agree, of transformation. Before beginning, let me acknowledge that we are all on unceded territories in Canada and Australia, and hopefully this session honors and respects their ancestors and their current peoples. Let me begin by introducing Robert Morgan, my co-moderator, and giving him a chance to say a few words. Bob, thank you.
Well, thank you, Rob. And let me say how pleased I am to be amongst the luminaries. I think you've assembled a really great group of thinkers. And I'm looking forward to participating in the discussion as we strive to create a better world through education.
Well, let's move to the panel. The panelists include Lester Rigney, Peter Freebody, Tammy Anderson, James Ladwig, and Narita Blair. Let's begin with Lester. Thank you, Lester.
Well, thanks, Rob, and it's a real honour to be here today. I think the key question that we're wanting to ask today, a key provocation, is what is the state of Aboriginal education in Australia? And I think that there's a prerequisite question that the theory is asking. And I think that this pre-question has really set my academic career in the last 14 months to write critically to the issue of what is the place of the Aboriginal child in our society. And I think that when we ask this question, we're not only are we getting to the literary question, the literacy questions that school are required to answer, but there's a precursor question to this, considering the atmosphere of what's happening to children in Australia at the moment. So for those that may not know, all of the children in detention in Northern Territory in Australia are Aboriginal. Not one non-Indigenous child in the Northern Territory in a prison are Aboriginal. The stark aspect is the torture of Aboriginal youth in the Northern Territory prison system. And this has sparked outrage and enormous backlash from the United Nations, asking Australia to hold to its signing of the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. And then thirdly, we have the Biloela family who were detained in detention camps run by Australia for almost 2,000 days. In terms of having their visa met and so on as refugees and immigrants. So the key question at the moment is, before we get to the question of how do we fix Aboriginal education, we have to ask this question: what is the place of the Aboriginal child in our society? And by doing that, this question is, Australia has not lived up, public education in Australia has not lived up to the promise of democracy. And this is, if we're suggesting that public schools are the place to achieve social justice, to achieve the bedrock of democracy, then publicness has to be defended, because the rights of the child, particularly the Aboriginal child, has not been met. The second key question that we're wanting to look at in terms of the state of Aboriginal education is that the Aboriginal child is still a fundamental and powerful knowledge producer, as it has always done for over 80,000 years. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the oldest people on the planet and have been doing education for 80,000 years. They carry the hopes and dreams, the Aboriginal child carries the hopes and dreams of Aboriginal communities, and are the barometer by which we measure democracy inside a nation state of particularly settler societies and Anglophone societies like Australia, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and so on. So we know that the Aboriginal child is competent, is intelligent, and is the bearer of rights as citizens in a nation state like Australia. So how do we explain the inequality that's happening? Why is schools not delivering and failing over the last decade, according to the Productivity Commission? Research around the numeracy and literacy rates in settler grammar, but the failure of Aboriginal education in Aboriginal languages and Aboriginal literacies in their own languages and in their own cultures. Why has school failed to make the Aboriginal learner belong? And if there's the struggle to belong in school, haven't we got the duty to be able to look at the role that settler grammar and its enforcement in a multicultural, multilingual society? The force of monolingualism on the multilingual learner. Does this have an effect? So let's look at five key theorists who are suggesting that the state of Aboriginal education is imperiled. So firstly, Kevin Lowe's work on decolonisation. And Kevin Lowe is still arguing an age-old question that we need to detach deficit from Aboriginal learners inside public schools. Now, this is, we can focus on this question, but there are several others that pose the deep-seated problems of Australia meeting its obligation on Aboriginal education. Bronwyn Carlson, in her work, is talking, the age-old question of racism and hegemony. We've got Gert Biester, which basically is drawing on Jürgen Habermas's structural transformation of the public sphere. Now, Gert Biester is talking about publicness and learnification. The key question that the public school is the bedrock of democracy and schools do the work of the nation. And that if Aboriginal children aren't getting their rights met, then this isn't the problem of the Aboriginal child, it's a problem of democracy. And that the public schools are the place where the child gets to know their rights inside of a democracy. So if schools are failing children, then we have a democracy issue of publicness, and therefore public schools are an issue that we need to address. The other aspect around Biester's notion is learnification. And that is that the definition of learning has become so narrowed, so fixed to settler grammar, that Aboriginal children have little room to encounter their own ontologies, their own epistemologies, their own linguistic frames. If learning and successful schooling is being so narrowly defined as being an expert in settler grammar phonics, then there is no place, according to the notion of learnification, for Aboriginal ontologies, Aboriginal ways of knowing, Aboriginal linguistic and cultural repertoires to come to class. So, for example, the Aboriginal child and its knowledge systems and its ancient wisdoms walks into class. And as a cultural capital, it wants to cash in all of these experiences, strengths, and intelligences, these cultural and linguistic repertoires that it has. It wants to cash this into the teacher. But in a learnification society built where success in schooling is narrowly defined to settler grammar, the teacher is only buying English-only literacy and numeracy. And all of the other intelligence that the Aboriginal child is bringing to class remains on the school floor because the pedagogies aren't fit for purpose to capture it. Another aspect is my work and Professor Haddam's work around cultural responsive pedagogies. And we're claiming that the two things that are wrong with the public schooling system in Australia is the lack of understanding of the super diverse learner that is now the new norm in all Australian classrooms and pretty much around the world. We're basing our theory on Veritovec's notion of superdiversity. And this is a concept whereby there is diversity inside diversity. So not only is the Australian learner, the settler, the immigrant, the Aboriginal, now it's also the diverse learner. There are the child that is now transgender, many different types of genders, many different types of sexual orientations walk into class. Many versions of digital learner walk into class. We also have many different types of Aboriginal diversity walks into class. So this super diverse learner and matched with the appalling rates of Aboriginal learning that's happening across the country, these two require us to move to a more culturally responsive education and pedagogical system that acknowledges settler grammar as critical, but also that the identities, the language and the linguistic and cultural repertoire that these super diverse learners now are bringing to classroom are critical. And then finally, Professor Megan Watkins' argument around the lazy multiculturalism. And we're finding that as Watkins's work that reads Australia as a lazy multicultural society in terms of its schooling, whereby cultural celebration is the only norm in absence of pedagogical transformation in schools. We only celebrate cultures. We don't link them to learning in any way, and that we've become a lazy multiculturalism. Whilst I agree with Watkins' arguments, my argument around the super diverse learner is that we've moved beyond multiculturalism. 1 in 3 parents are born overseas in Australia. So these are some of the theoretical induced understandings of the state of Aboriginal education in this country.
Thanks, Lester. Let's move to Peter Freebody. Peter, thank you.
Thanks for that, Rob. Thank you for inviting me onto this panel. It's a real privilege. My interest in the sorts of topics we're talking about and following on from a number of Lester's remarks is to do with the language and literacy issues. And but I open up with something that happened to me recently, which was when, after having given an acknowledgement to country and opening a session elsewhere, a person came up to me and said, you know, across the country hundreds of times a day we offer respect, and he said, I wonder how many people actually know anything about Aboriginal culture and language. What are we respecting, and does it mean anything more than a gesture to respect something we're not making any educational effort to find out about and to learn about? And it reminded me of nearly 30 years ago, it stuck in my mind that Paul Keating at a speech in Redfern talked about the need for settler Australia to come to terms with Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Australia. And I quote that because I went and found it was so powerful and memorable. It said it's a test of our self-knowledge, of how well we know the land we live in, how well we know our history, how well we recognise the fact that complex as our contemporary identity is, it cannot be separated from Aboriginal Australia. How well do we know what Aboriginal Australians know about Australia? There is everything to gain, he said. And it struck me then that all the discourse about the closing of the gap and so on, that the gap, to think about the gap as being turned around, who's in the red here, who needs help? And it seems to me that while politicians and other public figures talk about disappointing results from the Closing the Gap program, sometimes that it's hard to imagine the depth of disappointment that Aboriginal Australia must feel about the relative tokenism of our efforts in some of these regards, and including the kinds of knowledge producing stuff that orientation that Lester talked so eloquently about. So my work really in this area is to do with research around these things, and I owe a lot to my collaboration with Professor Nick Reed at the University of New England. He's a linguist and he has studied Aboriginal languages for a long time. I want to talk about, just talk about some recent research that goes on around this topic and then make some commentary around it. So I want to start with NAPLAN, which is sort of an easy target, I suppose, for many of us and for many in literacy teachers and English teachers. The critiques around NAPLAN have come and gone and we're very familiar with them. But recently, Joy Cumming and her colleagues in 2020 did a study that's published in the Educational Assessment, Evaluation and Accountability. These are statisticians. They did a longitudinal multi-level modelling of year 3 and year 5 NAPLAN, looking at the progress of Aboriginal students. And they found two large conclusions. And the first one is that the gap between Aboriginal, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students' progress increases as those groups go through the school years. So the school is actually either not taking account of, but not taking account of these sorts of orientations and knowledge bases to the point where they're actually becoming more separate. But as well, what they found is that the range of achievement within the Aboriginal Indigenous student cohort itself was increasing, that there were more students doing better and more students doing worse. So that gap is actually increasing as the school years progress, as well as the gap between the overall means of these test scores on the NAPLAN test. Another regard to the NAPLAN program, I just want to get this out of the way and talk about some other kinds of things about two-way and 50-50 and tandem education and so on. It's done by McQueen and others. Again, a very recent study, 2019, published in Language Testing, talking about the impact of NAPLAN according to a very, very large sample of principals and school teachers who teach in Aboriginal schools, remote schools, but also suburban fringe schools, asking them very detailed questions administered by Aboriginal educators themselves in structured interviews. And for the most part, almost all of those interviewed, and some of these were Indigenous, Aboriginal principals and teachers, and some are non-Indigenous, but they all commented, or nearly all commented to 3 points: that the language and content of these tests, the nature of the test engagement and environment itself, and the kind of washback that the school gets on the basis of these tests, combined to have negative effects on students, negative impacts on students and staff, with very little commensurate benefit coming back to them in terms of the test, the usability of the test data. And the primary issue here is that meaningful participation in a test like this depends critically on proficiency, equal proficiency in standard Australian English as a first language. And this, it seems to me, really points to an issue that is in a structural sense, not just an issue of who's speaking what kinds of languages, but also an issue of the statistical validity of the use of this kind of assessment as a policy lever to assist in the progress of learning of Aboriginal kids. It simply has got very little face validity, but also what Cumming and others said, it has very little construct validity in any productive way. So there's the whole notion of how we go about thinking about literacy education and what we can think of when we look at the very large number and growing number of locally conducted, school-based, home-based, place-based research projects, small-scale projects of the sort reported in Jennifer Rennie's recent book, that they are being overlaid with another kind of issue in how we think about literacy. And we need to think about whether or not we're talking about literacy as a policy issue, as some kind of large-scale effort, and the actualities of what makes that a valid effort on the ground. So what does the research say about the kind of teaching that is found in these settings? What kind of thing goes on? I'm falling here back on a study by Gutierrez and others reported just a few months ago in the Asia Pacific Journal of Teacher Ed. Systematic review of the research literature, peer-reviewed, evidence-based publications on literacy programs for Indigenous and Aboriginal Australian kids, and what aspects of it are being actually addressed in these kinds of programs. And they used as their focus the Bill Green's 3D model and the 4 roles model that Alan Luke and Jim Ladwick and others and myself have worked on, and looking at the conditions for success and the barriers to success. And the positive story here, along with Nick Reed's account of how quite a few thousand Australian non-Indigenous students are now learning Aboriginal language in schools. But the most positive message they came across with here was that most of the programs produce a significant kind of improvement. They show that the kids are generally getting better at a lot of these things. The gaps that they're represented is that the dominant focus, as Lester has already indicated, the dominant focus is on code breaking. It's basically phonics, phonemic awareness and phonic awareness and so on. Very few programs addressing anything to do with critical literacy or even really narrative understandings relating to culture and so on. So the cultural resources that a standard English speaker and a non-Indigenous Australian student might be able to bring through their general exposure to the culture, to the rendition of these sounds that they can produce out of the stories, is in tune with the kind of expectations that are in place. Whereas kids from a variety of backgrounds cannot, in a sense, appropriate their growing phonemic awareness and their understanding of the alphabetic system in their language. In the same way, they can't bring it alive if they're having different kinds of experiences that are just very different from what's expected. So again, what they recommended, what Gutierrez and colleagues recommended, was a balanced place-based literacy program, school community literacy partnerships, access to training and resources for schools, and school community research projects. None of this is new. None of that sounds unfamiliar to us all, but what they are wanting to say is that we can look at NAPLAN scores, we can look at beneath that at the actual programs and the focuses that they have and the kind of work that goes on. And that work itself is relatively limited in terms of what kids, Aboriginal kids, can get offered in school. So again, trying to turn the closing the gap and the disappointment issue around onto the school system, as Lester said. Think about it not so much as who's failing, but as who is being well served by the current provisions that we have in literacy education. Just a couple of other small things, I guess, from my orientation here is what Aboriginal people want to say about literacy themselves. And Wilson and Quinn and Abbott and others in 2018 Educational Research for Policy looked at the developing Aboriginal literacy through bilingual education issue. And they asked nearly 1,000 Aboriginal people between the age of 15 and 34. They completed individual surveys designed and administered by Aboriginal community researchers. And basically their modelling of the data showed this. The overwhelming majority and the most strongly endorsed approach is to rethink the relationship between communities and schools, between knowledge that communities have, knowledge that schools have. So this vast survey fits in very nicely with Lester's comments earlier. And learning about culture and literacy in your first language in school to develop Aboriginal literacy, they regard it as, and I quote, a necessary step to improve English literacy in remote schools. And that reminds us all again of what is now a well-established body of international literature, I guess headed up by the name when we talk about the research work of Bialystok on multilingual and bilingual education. There's now just a huge body of research that talks about the capability, significantly improving literacy outcomes from learning another language. Simple. This is international research. It's not focused particularly on Aboriginal or only on Aboriginal languages or Indigenous languages. And it has benefits over and above that. It's just been shown with a whole raft of studies benefiting personal, cognitive, social, communicative capacity, vocabulary choice, social fluency, self-esteem. It just goes on. There is a large literature that talks about the importance and the value of learning a second language. And it seems to me that the kind of issue, the thing that makes Aboriginal literacy such a test, such a challenge for education systems, is that there is still in our country a kind of vaguely 19th century notion of the ethno-nation, that it is monolingual. Nobody's even bothered ever formulating the fact that the official language of Australia is English, because it's just taken that everybody kind of knows that, even though, as Lester said, we've got 28 to 30% or more of parents born overseas, and we had in 1788 about 250 Aboriginal Indigenous languages. 13 of those, according to Nick Reed's research, are still spoken and are still live. About 100 or more are endangered, and more than 100 are gone. So there is an issue about rethinking who's disappointed, who is really suffering from not closing the gap, and to return to Keating's idea that one of the long-term programs that needs to be put in place, and this is what makes short-term electoral cycles so damaging to the kind of topic we're talking about, the complexity and the depth of it and its history, is there needs to be some, it seems to me, structural attempt to put in place a body that can coordinate and plan long-term research and development around the teaching of Aboriginal languages in school, and to rethink the whole notion of schooling, in Lester's terms as well, as a maintenance of language and cultural connection, and the connection to the vibrancies of non-Indigenous society with the depth and vibrance of Aboriginal society. And that, to me, comes through nicely in the Uluru Statement from the heart. That finishes like this: we believe our ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. This is not just for the benefit of Aboriginal Australians, it is centrally about that benefit, but its repercussions for the value to Australian society more generally. And the quote goes on from Uluru: when we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Let's now move to Tammy Anderson. Thank you, Tammy.
Yama, everybody. Thank you for having me today. I certainly also want to acknowledge that we are on traditional lands. Where you are, where I am, the sacredness of our country is critical to us, as are the stories and the elders that come from it. I certainly concur with the sentiments of the panelists so far. And as Brother Lester said, schools do the work of the nation. And I certainly feel like it's incumbent on us as school leaders to determine what that work can look like. For me, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story today and have a yarn with you to weave in the story of a school. My role is a school leader. I'm a principal in a small dynamic public school in southwestern Sydney. I'm a Biripi woman from the mid-north coast of New South Wales. I have a very, very small part of the story here today, but I really want to tell it from the school space. I spoke about leaders determining what Aboriginal education can look like, in particular how our children will succeed. And it's important, I suppose, for us to think about how do we hold schools, leaders and systems accountable for the work that needs to happen in our schools. I'm really drawn to things like our professional teaching standards and what we put out there in terms of the expectations of teachers in a system like New South Wales. But I suppose something that resonates strongly with me is that professional standards certainly don't teach. and what work needs to occur for us to ensure that the teachers we put in front of schools, put in front of students every day are the best at their game, but also are knowledgeable about what is happening for our kids in classrooms, that they are providing a space for our children to tell their narratives and for their beings to be honoured. I'm going to pick up a little bit on what Brother Lester discussed in regards to what's happening for Aboriginal children in schools and with staff. I'm leading a school currently where we're trying to really change the negative rhetoric that we know and we hear that lies heavy on our children and our people in education. And it's by no means an easy feat. It hasn't been, it's been a work in progress. And I've been on the journey in school leadership for 8 years, but certainly have been in the space of teaching for a lot longer. As a school at a foundational level, we knew that we needed to redesign our thinking, that I had a responsibility as an Aboriginal leader to overlay the black lens, if you will, on what we do as a school and how we create space for change. It was something that we developed in terms of our visions and our beliefs and our philosophies that were going to kind of underpin every bit of work that we did some 8 years ago, and was something that we didn't develop for a school community. It was certainly developed with the school community, and we know that is best practice. And I think sometimes schools get a little bit, I suppose, overwhelmed and overloaded with the expectations of a system, that they forget that we're actually working for a community, and we need to be working with them in order to create real systemic change. For us, I suppose I wanted to share a little bit about what we do as a school, but also where we sit, that at our school we say publicly, and we have our community say publicly, that everyone will feel a strong sense of belonging where their diverse and unique being is honoured. And in particular, that resonates very strongly with me as an Aboriginal person, but also for the 121 Aboriginal students in our school, that our kids will be brave and supported to take risks of their own learning, and to jump into spaces and arenas that they're not very familiar with in order to grow and learn, that they will be exposed to and have high expectations relationships with everyone that they encounter, that is built on a foundation of mutual respect, and that we will empower them to be learners for life. For us, in terms of our belief statements, things like communities we know are critical to our school success, and we're certainly not doing it alone. And we just heard Peter talk about that work that we need to do with our communities to ensure that what we offer as a school is really reflective of the needs of our communities that we work in. We talk about and hold true the notion that there's power in every interaction, and we as educators can choose which way that power looks and feels for children, and we have a responsibility to empower our children, and we make sure that we know students, and we know that our students know that they have a right to learn. And so they were some of kind of the foundational things that we did to create some change, and not everything is a fairy tale by any means. We're certainly a work in progress, and Brother Lester talked about Aboriginal children being knowledge holders, and his work in that space really resonates with me quite strongly. Knowing that we need to honour and learn from our Aboriginal learners is a big part of our story. In terms of taking that black lens and overlaying it over everything, it's really been a challenge for our school leadership team who are not Aboriginal people. We've really unpacked what it is that we're doing around curriculum and how we are engaging with our Aboriginal learners, what we're doing around school planning to ensure that there is free space for our kids to have the exposure and opportunities to participate in language programs, to participate in cultural education programs with community people. And it really does challenge a lot of my colleagues in that space, because we're really, I suppose, created and developed by some of the expectations of the system. And so we've had to be able to work within that system, but also challenge how it is that we can do business differently for our students. We've really seen a real uptake in our local language program that's happening in our preschool space. We're starting it in our earlier years to ensure that our kids get the best access to it, and that language then is alive throughout all of their primary school experience here at Bry Road. We've been a school that really has placed high expectations and holding one another accountable. I expect that the community hold me accountable as a leader, and that they can have real robust and honest conversations with me. But I think it's about creating a space where community feel safe enough to do that. And although that I'm an Aboriginal woman who has come from this community, I still have a responsibility to be seeking out strong opinions of what we're doing well and what we're not doing well, and making sure that my staff are very much aware of that in order to affect change in a classroom level. For us, we know that literacy can empower or disempower depending on how it is utilised, and we have a responsibility as teachers to make sure that we are very responsive to the needs of students in our classroom, that we are working in collaboration with experts in our community and experts within our school to ensure that our students are getting the absolute best access to literacy and are utilising that in our classrooms. Creating a sense of belonging has probably been one of my easier challenges in a school. And I think that's because being an Aboriginal learner, I remembered very clearly about what that felt like in a classroom, to not be empowered, to not have a space and to not feel that sense of belonging. It was a space where the monoculture, the dominant culture was represented very, very well, and that I had to really just fit into that space. And whilst there's been some, I suppose, some benefits to that, for me, there's also been more cons to that than there have been pros, I believe. And I think that empowering our Aboriginality in our students empowers them. And that's what I see my work as a leader in the school as being. And culture, certainly for me at Briar Road, does take the lead, and we take the lead from culture.
Thank you, Tammy. Next is James Ladwig. Thank you, James.
Thank you, and hello to everybody else. It is indeed an honor to be among this group. That I've been working with the schools in the far west of New South Wales for a couple of decades now, and in remote schools it's a constant struggle to be able to meet any of the official demands, not least of which is because of the difficulty of getting teachers to cover them all. But it is in this context where I have with Bob had long-standing conversations about different ways of thinking about and constructing curriculum with teachers. So to give you a context, the first larger context is one I kind of learned or kind of articulated in the conversation that was actually occurring in Banff around the questions of kind of how do we restate the nature of the curriculum problem. And in that, one of the big questions that came up was, to what degree can we actually anticipate any kind of change? And then typically, the way I have learned to think about change is, change happens when people recognize there's our crises. So the question became, what kind of crises are we facing today? And when I'm working with my Indigenous colleagues around the planet, is try to think about what it is the schooling actually does and what schools itself function. Now that's not a new kind of approach, but in this larger dynamic in which we live and the global problems we currently face, some of that becomes a little more cut and dried. And that is, and I've articulated this before in some of my writing, we've got two major problems when we're talking about school outcomes that aren't academic outcomes. When we start thinking about all the other things that schools do that people don't necessarily measure, I'm not saying we should measure them, but there's some very simple ones. One is we still haven't learned how to educate ourselves in a manner that decreases our propensity to kill each other. The other is we haven't figured out how to educate ourselves in a manner that increases our capacity to live sustainably so that we don't make the planet basically uninhabitable for humans. We simply don't know how to do it. Based on the recognition also is the recognition that the knowledges that are distributed in schools and created in schools are fundamentally related to structures of power and control. And the knowledge we need for these kind of this alternative ways of not killing each other and not killing the planet is knowledge we don't currently have. And then the idea of trying to distribute it becomes even more interesting if you think back about the notion of a national curriculum being decided by a largely political compromise. Now, we also have to recognize that school systems are fundamentally modern school systems over time, and this is something that has been clear and made much more clear in recent translated writings of Foucault, but it has also been identified very early on by writers like Fanon, that the basic structures of schooling are techniques of power that essentially narrow our interest down to self-interest. So at the end point, everything becomes entirely individualized, but there's a whole range of interest in between the global and the individual, be that national, be that local. And what schools do is they really very much pin it down as small as possible. We also have to recognize that schooling is basically a process of accumulation. That is that we have different forms of capital, to use the language of Bourdieu, where we've got generational transfer of wealth, knowledge, skills, and dispositions being used by younger generations to reinvest in capital, et cetera. And the schools have largely been put to the test of passing down capital from generation to generation, so that the gaps we are talking about in terms of achievement are not simply gaps of reading, they're gaps of access to power. And then we also have to recognize the curriculum and pedagogy in modern schools themselves are built from a power that is based on a classic form of alienation that we've known for, or has been articulated at least for a couple hundred years, but become more and more evident if you see the growing accumulation of material wealth and goods and the perpetual consumption that we have. There's a clear alienation of the human from the natural environment, let's call it. There's an alienation of the humans from their own labor, from their self, and from each other. This is part and parcel of modernity. This is part and parcel of what schools do. Now, if we keep that in mind, I'd like to suggest there's an alternative path, but the alternative path I would suggest starts very much from looking at the concrete situation we live in. Now, this is where some of the ideas you're going to hear are going to reflect a lot of what I've learned from working with my Aboriginal colleagues. First observation I would make, in the far west where I work, it is on a river known as the Darling River that is currently under threat. It has water at the minute, but for many, many, many years it has not. It is in the realm of the possible that this river will die because of the use of water upstream. There is one branch of the river that hasn't had water for many, 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 many years, down at the bottom, by the way. The current governance structures clearly is not sufficient to keep this river healthy. This river is known as the Baka, by the way, named by the Bakanji people. But the control of the water has nothing to do with the local people. The control of the water has to do with government agencies that are largely influenced by large corporations, political interests, etc. So given that governance structure, the local communities and the future generations are reliant on that river, completely reliant on that river. It is literally the river, the water they need to live. But there has yet been, until very recently, very little attempt to develop the knowledge that is used by those external powers from the collective experience and understanding of the wisdom of the people who live on the river. The school curriculum remains highly generalized and sanitized. It barely touches any of this knowledge and any of it. Kids don't learn about it. Certainly not in official curriculum, and you will find very little of it in very sanitized forms of it in national curriculum. Certainly not about the specific river, but about the rivers around the continent. Now, the current river management, you got to keep in mind that we need better systems of monitoring, understanding, and managing knowledge about the river. We need to recognize also that there is untapped capacity in the existing institutions. Now, that includes a little simple observation. On this particular river, on the Darling River that runs through New South Wales, it connects to a river down with Leicester's down on the Murray, but the Darling itself runs largely through New South Wales and up into Queensland. And along that whole pathway, it's a couple thousand kilometers, there are more schools than there are water monitoring stations. There are more schools than environmental and agricultural offices. So the loss of the river of the knowledge is accompanied by the fact that we have many, many communities where knowledge can be produced about the river, but is not currently being produced, or at least not shared widely. We should also point out that there are a whole bunch of existing scientists up and down the river and the lakes and the Nindi Lakes that are generating new knowledge about plant populations, bird populations, subterranean crustaceans in the rivers. There's all kinds of river knowledge being generated by existing scientists along the river. And there's also a large amount of knowledge along the river from the multiple generation of settler farmers, by the way. So you have farmers whose families have been on there for 100 years. It's nothing like the 60,000 before, but it is 100 years of knowledge that we probably shouldn't lose. And so the question becomes, what if we started thinking about curriculum differently? Rather than starting to thinking about curriculum as a form of accumulation for individual kids, what if we start thinking about schooling and particularly schooling in these contexts as places from which we can build existing, take and kind of record the existing knowledge of the curriculum carried by two local sources. If we recognize the need for the next generation to be active in recording and sharing the existing knowledge, we have kids that can learn directly from the knowledge keepers themselves, from the producers themselves, and record that knowledge. We can recognize the need for the next generation to become active participants and leaders in the production of the new knowledge about their rivers, and about all of the resources on which their own future depends. We can recognize the centrality of children and future generations and the ethics and actions we take that impact on that river. So the practical kind of play out of this locally where I work is the students have become and are becoming collectors and recorders and curators of the knowledge that exists on the systems, talking to elders, finding out what the local scientists are doing, etc. The students can regularly monitor and collect data. If you want to learn science out in the far west, the best place to do that is outside, not in school, and to do direct observation of the water, the land, the flora, and the fauna. It takes a while to learn how to read that land if you're not from it. But a lot of the kids are able to see things that teachers can't. But what the kids can learn from teachers is the scientific manner of standardized recording, measurement, etc. The students can share that data with other river communities up and down the river. The languages are shared up and down the river. And they can be analyzed with and by the students, developing reports and future plans for continuing and new monitoring as they go along. The students could periodically join together all along this river to report their findings and recommendations to local governments, regional governments, state governments, national governments. In the process, schools and teachers become a central hub for the knowledge needed to care for the management of the river, from town to town, up and down the river, ultimately through the full Murray-Darling Basin, if we can get this done. To the global level, the river here, let's just think as an emblematic kind of metaphor. If we're going to understand that river, we need to work with the knowledge that we have and before we lose that knowledge. But that doesn't have to be just about the river. We can think about it in any location around all the major issues that we have around sustainability, be that water, be that waste, be that energy. Get kids actively participating in creating the knowledge we need to develop models of consumption and production of these resources such that they can continue on into the future. The curriculum model can be applicable to any location. We've got local knowledge, we've got universal knowledge everywhere.
Thanks, James. Next is Narita Blair. Thanks very much, Narita.
Howdy, everyone. Thanks, Rob and Bob, for inviting me to this session. I'd like to acknowledge Darkinjung country on which I'm ensconced. That's country with a capital C. I'd like to acknowledge the countries that everyone engaging with this forum have come from. The spirits of the ancestors from these countries, elders and contemporary custodians, which is all of us, because we all have a responsibility to care for and look after country. I don't do this acknowledgement individually to be politically correct. I do it because it's a way for all of us to connect, to relate to, and develop a sense of belonging to country with a capital C, to ourselves, to the people engaging in this forum, and also to the ideas that are being shared amongst members of the panel, but also through the group engaging in the forum. I do this through story, and I'd like to share a story that Professor Sally Morgan has written about. She was doing some research into Captain Cook. So she was up on country with her grandfather, and you can just see them sitting in country yarning with each other, and she's sharing her research. And that old man says to her, "You know, my girl, that fella, that Cook fella, he doesn't know how to read the signs." So let's have a look at what happened and the story itself. I want you fellas to imagine what we now know as Botany Bay. Imagine the environment on the land, the trees, the Gweagal people, the birds, the insects. Imagine the Endeavour ship, the people on the ship, the colours. So get sort of an image of those two things. Then we see Captain Cook off the ship on the land, walking up to one of the trees and cutting into the tree. He cuts in his name and he cuts in Endeavour, the name of the ship. That was the first contact the West had with one of many thousands of living beings in this country. Humans, trees, stars, flowers, insects, moon, they're all part of country with a capital C. So what was Cook doing? For him, it was a mark of presence and territory. For the British, the Crown, it was a warning to other colonial powers. It was an expression of legal interest, and it was a clear indication that he sought to annex the country for the British Crown. From an Indigenous knowings perspective, from the Gweagal perspective, who had responsibility to care for all elements of that country, it was mutilation. Their responsibility was shattered. It was the first sign of disrespecting. It was the first sign of illiteracy. So what I'd like to do through that story is move on to share an image or a series of images through a graphic that I developed around the model of liliology. You'll see liliology has 4 elements: brick wall representing Western knowledge, water lily representing Indigenous knowings. There's lightning in the middle, which represents lightning, thunder, and over all 3 other elements, there's a spider web. I don't have time in this space to go through the detail of all the elements. Suffice to say, the brick wall represents the academy and Western knowledge, because the academy is the research that leads to policy, to people's thinking, to the way we view and see the world. So Western knowledge. The bricks in the brick wall represent the disciplines. They represent curriculum subjects. They represent philosophies, research methodologies. And bricks in a brick wall are layered hierarchically, and there's mortar between them. There's that separation between them. What I found in developing this was that, you know, within the academy, we talked a lot about being interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. So I tried to use pigments in the bricks to develop that. But the reality is there's not very much of that cross-fertilization across disciplines. On the other side of the image and a graphic is the water lily. A water lily is rooted in country. Country being that water, the earth, the air. It's grounded and moving in country. The bulb rhizomatically descends, and that for me represents spirit knowings. I won't go through all of the elements as I've said, but if we move up to the flower, which is what's invisible, and that's where we story through different genres. But we also need to note that the petals in that flower are not homogeneous. They overlap. They're different expressions of Indigenous knowings. They're holistic, synergetic, and they're organic. Now, in between Western knowledge and Indigenous knowings. And I need to say here, I guess, that I use the term Indigenous knowings because I don't have my own language other than English. So I needed to differentiate between Indigenous knowings and Western knowledge, hence the term knowings. So the in-between space represented by lightning represents a hell of a lot of energy, a lot of emotion. Gee, it can be messy when we start working in that space between Indigenous knowings and Western knowledge. It can be conflicting and it can be transformative. And the final element of the graphic is the spider web. And if you walk outside, you walk into the spider web, you know that they're sticky, that they're transparent. And in a spider's web, the vibrations can be felt from one part of the web to the other. So using the web to join all of the elements embodies a holistic and organic approach. So that's the model. I want to emphasize there's not one set of Indigenous knowings. And Indigenous knowings are different to Western knowledge. Western knowledge is different to Indigenous knowings. One is not better than the other. One is not inferior. They're just different. So if we have a look at liliology, and I want to use an example to bring out that space in between. So I want to use the concept of story to bring out the different emphases and elements from Western knowledge and Indigenous knowings. If we look at the concept of story from a Western perspective, Western knowledge, we have words in lines, so it's linear across pages. We look for a right answer to a question. We have a beginning, a middle, and an end. When we talk about story from Indigenous knowings, there's cyclic or spiral, there's repetition because it goes back into each other. There's no beginning and end. There are multiple entry and exit points. It's multimodal in terms of dance, art, and so on. Stories can coexist. They don't have to contradict each other. So it's about widening the possibility of stories. And Hokari, I use his name respectfully because he's no longer with us. He speaks about Indigenous knowings or Gurindji knowings from his perspective is about the bundle of possibilities without judgment. So bundle of possibilities without judgment as opposed to looking for a right answer to a question. Now, again, one is not better than the other or different or inferior. They're just different to each other. So you can't really try to fit Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous knowings of story into Western knowledge and its storing of story. And that, I think, is what we're trying to do. So I guess I'm taking a different approach to what we've heard before in that I don't believe, or I believe that we are all as practitioners and all of our systems are embedded within the brick wall. I don't believe that any policy initiatives, any past educational efforts and strategies and practices in literacy or in education per se have fundamentally stated the obvious. That is that Indigenous knowings exist, they are distinct, they are real in their own right. Indigenous knowings is more than adding perspectives. It's more than adding that turmeric to a stew to add a bit of colour and flavour. It's more than cultural competency. Thank you.
Thanks, Narita, and thank you all the panelists. Thank you, audience, as well. What you participated in is the first portion of the panel. There is another portion of the panel which is on a separate website and folks would have to access this independently. We've got the website information on the screen now for you if in fact you want to be part of listening to the conversation between the panelists about the issues presented in their presentations. To everybody, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the conference, for allowing us to participate in your event. I wish you the very best. Thank you.